The loud sound of the ambulance siren broke the calm of the neighborhood that evening. Children who had been playing outside stopped and stared, while adults whispered in fear. The vehicle stopped right in front of the Johnsons' house, and within seconds, two paramedics rushed in carrying their equipment. Minutes later, they came out holding their teenage daughter, Blessing, who looked pale, shaken, and too weak to stand. Nobody understood what had happened, but one thing was certain. The young girl had gone through something terrible. The neighbors exchanged worried glances, asking each other how such a quiet family could suddenly face such a crisis. Blessing's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, were both at work when the incident happened. The only person believed to have been with her during the day was their next-door neighbor, Auntie Kemi, a woman in her early 30s who was known for being friendly and always willing to help whenever the Johnsons were not around. To outsiders, she was a generous neighbor, someone to trust. But Blessing's trembling eyes and refusal to speak when asked what happened told another story. Something disturbing had taken place behind closed doors, and Blessing seemed too afraid to speak up. What no one knew at that moment was that this incident had been building up for weeks. Behind the cheerful smiles and kind greetings, Auntie Kemi had a secret that even her closest friends did not know. She often invited Blessing into her apartment when her parents were away, offering snacks and gifts to gain her trust. On the outside, it looked harmless, but in truth, it was part of a hidden plan that would later shock the entire neighborhood. Blessing's silence that night was not just fear, it was the weight of secrets she had carried alone, and the truth was about to change how everyone saw the helpful neighbor forever.
The next morning, the neighborhood was still buzzing with gossip. Some said Blessing fainted because of stress from school, while others claimed it was food poisoning. But Mrs. Johnson knew her daughter too well. Blessing was not the kind of girl who kept things hidden. She usually told her mother everything. Every small issue at school, every friend she made, every worry she carried. This sudden silence was unusual, and it left her mother restless. When Mrs. Johnson visited her daughter in the hospital later that day, she held her hand tightly and asked in a soft voice, "Blessing, my child, what happened yesterday?" But Blessing only shook her head and turned away, tears rolling down her cheeks. That silent cry was louder than any words, and it broke her mother's heart. She knew someone had hurt her daughter, but who? And why was she so scared to speak? The truth was that Auntie Kemi had been slowly manipulating Blessing for weeks. It started with small things, offering to braid her hair after school, giving her little gifts like biscuits and juice, and even allowing her to watch movies in her apartment. To Blessing, it felt like having an older sister, someone who understood her better than her busy parents. But what the young girl didn't realize was that these acts of kindness were planned steps to break her defenses. One evening, when Mrs. Johnson had to work late and Mr. Johnson was on a business trip, Kemi invited Blessing over again. That was the night when things changed. Kemi closed the curtains, lowered her voice, and began to behave in a way that confused the young girl. What seemed innocent at first turned into something Blessing didn't fully understand, but instantly knew was wrong. Kemi told her to keep it their little secret, warning her that nobody would believe her if she told anyone. From that night on, Blessing carried a heavy burden in silence. The ambulance visit was not just because of fainting. It was the result of fear, trauma, and the weight of a secret too big for her young heart to hold. Blessing's father returned from his trip the following evening. The moment he stepped into the hospital room and saw his daughter's fragile state, his cheerful face collapsed into worry. "My little angel, what happened to you?" he asked, but Blessing stayed quiet, staring at the bed sheet. The silence was unbearable. Mr. Johnson turned to his wife, who could only shake her head with watery eyes. They both knew something was wrong, but the words were locked inside their daughter. Later that night, when Mr. and Mrs. Johnson sat alone in their living room, the discussion turned sharp. "This isn't ordinary," Mr. Johnson said firmly. "Somebody must have done something to her. A child doesn't become like this overnight." Mrs. Johnson agreed, but whispered, "She only spends time at home, school, and sometimes with Kemi next door. Could it be?" The thoughts hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Kemi had been their trusted neighbor for years. She was even the one they sometimes called to help when they needed someone to watch Blessing. The possibility that she could harm their daughter felt unthinkable. But at the same time, the pieces were beginning to fit together. Blessing, meanwhile, lay awake in her hospital bed, replaying the frightening memories in her mind. She remembered how Kemi always made her promise not to tell anyone. "If you tell," Kemi had whispered one night, "they will hate you. They will think you are bad." Those words echoed in her head, filling her with shame she didn't deserve. She wanted to scream, to let it all out, but the fear of her parents' disappointment held her back. What she didn't know was that the hospital psychologist who came to check on her could see through her silence. The woman noticed the signs, the trembling hands, the fearful glances, and the way Blessing avoided talking about home. She made a note in her file: "Possible abuse, needs careful questioning." The truth was getting closer to being exposed, but it would come with a storm that no one in the neighborhood expected. The next day, the psychologist arranged a private session with Blessing. She spoke gently, avoiding direct questions at first. Instead, she asked about school, friends, and favorite hobbies. Slowly, Blessing began to open up, though her words were short and uncertain. Then the psychologist asked, "Is there someone who makes you feel uncomfortable?" Blessing froze. Her lips trembled, her hands twisted the bed sheets, and for a moment, she looked like she would cry, but she whispered nothing, only shaking her head quickly. The psychologist noticed her reaction and didn't press further. Instead, she said, "Sometimes people we trust do things that are not right. It's never your fault if they do. You are not bad, and you will never be blamed for telling the truth." Those words stayed with Blessing even after the session ended. For the first time, someone suggested that maybe what happened wasn't her fault. That thought alone gave her a tiny spark of courage. Back at home, the Johnsons could not sleep. Mr. Johnson kept pacing the living room, his mind replaying every memory of Kemi's visits. He remembered how she always offered to help with Blessing, how she insisted she loved spending time with her. At the time, it looked like kindness, but now, in the light of his daughter's condition, it felt like a trap. He clenched his fists. If she had anything to do with this, I will not forgive myself for trusting her, he muttered. Meanwhile, in her own apartment, Kemi was restless too. She sat on her couch, staring at her phone, replaying the moment the ambulance arrived. She never expected things to spiral this far. She had always told herself that what she was doing was harmless, just love in a different form. But deep down, she knew it was wrong. The fear of being exposed gnawed at her. What if Blessing spoke? What if the parents suspected her? Kemi's secrets were no longer safe, and she could feel the walls closing in. By the end of the week, Blessing was discharged from the hospital.
Though her body looked fine, her spirit remained heavy. Back at home, her parents treated her gently, avoiding too many questions so she wouldn't feel pressured. But silence lingered in the house like a cloud, and every time the doorbell rang, Blessing flinched. One afternoon, when Mrs. Johnson stepped outside to throw away trash, she found Kemi standing by the gate, smiling as though nothing had happened.
Wait oh. Before we move on, let me just remind you small. If you're enjoying this story, don't just dey look me like that. Hit that subscribe button and like this video now. So anytime we drop new African stories, you'll be the first to hear them. Alright, make we continue.
Ah, neighbor, I heard Blessing is back home. How is she now? Kemi asked warmly. Her voice was calm, her eyes wide with false concern. But Mrs. Johnson studied her carefully, searching for any sign of guilt. She's resting, she replied shortly, not offering more details. Kemi's smile flickered for a second before she quickly regained it. Please let me know if you need anything, she added before walking away. But in that short encounter, Mrs. Johnson's suspicion grew stronger. Something about Kemi's eagerness felt wrong. Inside, Blessing overheard the conversation through the window. Her chest tightened. She wanted to run and hide. Kemi's voice, once familiar, now felt like a chain around her neck. She remembered the nights when Kemi would close the curtains and whisper, "This is our little secret." Blessing's fear wasn't just about what had already happened. It was also the constant threat that Kemi might come again, smiling in front of others while holding her captive in silence. That night, Blessing had a nightmare. She dreamt of being trapped in Kemi's living room, with the curtains closed and the lights dimmed. In the dream, she screamed for her parents, but no sound came out. When she woke sweating, she realized she couldn't carry the secret much longer. Her silence was destroying her from the inside, and if she didn't speak soon, she feared she might never escape the weight of it. The following Sunday, the Johnsons went to church, hoping that prayer and fellowship might bring peace to their troubled home. Blessing sat quietly beside her mother, staring at the ground. During the sermon, the pastor spoke about truth, urging the congregation to remember that light always exposes darkness. Blessing felt her chest tighten. Every word seemed directed at her, as if the pastor knew the secret she was hiding. She clenched her fists, battling between fear and the urge to finally speak. After service, the family was greeted by neighbors, including Kemi, who came dressed elegantly, her face glowing with confidence. She hugged Mrs. Johnson warmly, then patted Blessing's shoulder. "My dear girl, you must get well quickly," she said sweetly. To outsiders, it looked like care, but to Blessing, the touch felt like chains. She stiffened and avoided eye contact, hoping nobody noticed. But Mrs. Johnson did. Her mother's eyes narrowed slightly, as if a silent confirmation of her suspicions had been made. That evening, Blessing sat on her bed, remembering the pastor's words about light exposing darkness. Slowly, she began to write in her school notebook. Her hand shook as she formed the words. "Auntie Kemi told me to keep a secret. She removes my clothes and underwear and did things to me when you were not home. She always puts her finger inside my private parts." Tears stained the paper, but she kept writing, pouring out everything she had held inside for weeks. When she finished, she folded the paper and placed it under her pillow, unsure if she was brave enough to hand it over. Meanwhile, Kemi sat alone in her apartment, pacing restlessly. She could feel tension in the air. Blessing's silence was no longer comforting. It was dangerous. She thought about moving away, disappearing before anything was revealed, but a part of her believed Blessing would never dare to talk. That confidence, however, was slowly crumbling. The secret she thought she had buried was beginning to shake the very ground beneath her.
That night, Mrs. Johnson entered Blessing's room to check on her before bed. As she adjusted the blanket, the folded paper slipped out from under the pillow and fell to the floor. She picked it up, expecting it to be school notes, but as she unfolded it and began to read, her hands froze. The words on the page made her chest tighten and her eyes fill with tears. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She sank into the chair by the bed, staring at her daughter, who was pretending to be asleep.
Blessing, she whispered shakily. Is this true? Blessing opened her eyes slowly, tears already streaming down her face. She didn't speak, but the silent nod she gave was enough to confirm everything. Mrs. Johnson held her tightly, weeping into her hair. My child, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you, she said, her voice trembling. Blessing cried harder, finally feeling the weight of the secret begin to lift. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone in her pain. Mr. Johnson was called into the room, and when he read the note, his reaction was fiery. His fist tightened, and his voice shook with anger. That woman, she dared to do this under our roof while we trusted her, he explained. He wanted to storm out immediately, but Mrs. Johnson stopped him. We must be careful, she warned. We need to protect Blessing and make sure this is handled the right way. Her words calmed him slightly, though his eyes still burned with fury. Meanwhile, next door, Kemi lay awake in her apartment, unaware that her secret had just been exposed. She hummed softly to herself, trying to convince her mind that everything was under control. But in reality, the noose around her lies was tightening, and the Johnsons had already taken the first step toward bringing her darkness into the light. The following morning, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson decided they could no longer keep the discovery to themselves. They went straight to the police station, carrying Blessing's written note as evidence. The officer who received them listened carefully, his face growing stern as Mrs. Johnson read the contents aloud. This is a serious matter, he said firmly. We cannot ignore it. We'll need to question the child privately and then confront the suspect. Hearing those words gave the Johnsons a mix of relief and fear. Relief that action would finally be taken, and fear of what might come next. When they returned home later that day, Kemi was outside, watering her plants, smiling as usual. She waved at them cheerfully, but this time, the Johnsons did not wave back. Their silence was cold and sharp, and Kemi felt a sudden chill creep up her spine. Something had changed. She hurried back into her apartment, her mind racing. Did Blessing say something? No, she wouldn't dare, Kemi muttered to herself, though her voice trembled. For the first time, doubt began to eat away at her confidence. Blessing, who watched from her bedroom window, felt both scared and relieved. She had broken the silence, and now the truth was no longer just hers to carry. But fear still lingered. What if Kemi tried to harm her for speaking up? That night, she slept with her light on, clutching her teddy bear tightly. Her parents checked on her often, whispering prayers at her bedside.
The next morning, a plainclothes officer visited the house to speak with Blessing gently, asking her to explain what happened. Though her voice shook, she finally spoke the words out loud. Each detail made her parents' hearts ache, but it also gave strength to the case being built against Kemi. By the time the officer left, the Johnsons knew the confrontation was no longer far away. The neighbor who once smiled so sweetly was about to face the truth she thought would remain hidden forever. The police wasted no time. That same evening, 2 officers knocked on Kemi's door. She opened it with her usual smile, but it quickly faded when she saw their stern expressions. "Good evening, madam," one of them said. "We need you to come with us to answer some questions." Kemi's heart raced, but she forced a laugh. "Questions? About what?" she asked, trying to sound innocent. The officers didn't explain much. only stating it concerned her relationship with the Johnsons' daughter. At that moment, her face went pale. As the officers led her away, neighbors peeked through their windows whispering in shock. What could Kemi have done? Some asked. She was always so nice. Others exchanged uneasy glances, remembering how often she had been with Blessing. Mrs. Johnson stood at her doorway, holding her daughter close, watching as the woman she once trusted was escorted into the police car. Blessing buried her face into her mother's side, trembling, but also feeling a strange sense of relief, like a heavy chain was finally loosening. At the station, Kemi was placed in a small room. The questions came quickly. Have you ever been alone with Blessing? Did you invite her into your apartment? Did you tell her to keep secrets from her parents? Kemi tried to deny everything at first, but her voice was shaky. The officers pressed harder, presenting the written notes and Blessing's recorded testimony. Her defenses crumbled. She realized there was no escape. The truth had caught up with her.
Back at home, Mr. Johnson sat quietly, his face clenched on the table. "I should have seen it," he whispered. His wife placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't blame yourself. What matters now is that Blessing is safe and justice will be served." For the first time in weeks, there was hope in her voice. The storm had broken, but healing could finally begin. At the police station, Kemi sat hunched over, her face buried in her hands. She knew denial was useless now, but she still tried to twist the story. "I didn't hurt her. I only showed her love in a way no one else did. She wanted their attention." The officers exchanged disgusted looks. One of them leaned forward and said firmly, "What you call love is abuse. A child can never consent to what you did. You betrayed her trust." His words cut through Kemi's excuses like a blade. Meanwhile, the Johnsons were asked to attend a family counseling session arranged by the police. Blessing's psychologist explained gently, "She will need time. Right now, she feels guilty and afraid even though she did nothing wrong. Your support and patience will be her healing." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson listened carefully, promising to give their daughter the reassurance she needed. They held Blessing between them, reminding her that she was loved and protected and that what happened was not her fault. That evening, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors were shocked, while others admitted they had once felt something strange about Kemi, but never spoke up. "We should have paid attention," one woman whispered to another. "Maybe this could have been prevented." The scandal shook the community, reminding everyone that danger sometimes hides behind smiling faces. Parents began keeping a closer watch on their children, warning them never to keep secrets from home, no matter who asked. Back in the interrogation room, Kemi finally broke down in tears. She admitted that she had groomed Blessing slowly, convincing herself that what she was doing was harmless. But as the evidence piled up, she realized the truth. She had crossed the line that could never be erased. The officers noted her confession, preparing the case for court. Justice was moving forward, and for once, the mask Kemi wore in public had been torn off completely. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the Johnsons walked into the courtroom with Blessing between them. Though she was nervous, her parents held her hands tightly, whispering that she was safe. The judge, a stern-looking woman, made it clear from the start, "This case concerns the protection of a child. The truth must be spoken without fear." The courtroom was silent, filled with neighbors and curious faces who had come to witness the trial. Kemi stood at the defendant's table, her once confident smile gone. She looked smaller, weaker, and avoided eye contact with the Johnsons. When asked to respond to the charges, she muttered,
I made mistakes, but I never meant harm. But the prosecutor, however, presented Blessing's written note, her testimony, and Kemi's recorded confession from the station. Every word felt like a heavy stone falling into place, leaving Kemi with no room to escape. When it was Blessing's turn to speak, the courtroom held its breath. Her voice shook at first, but with her parents' encouraging nods, she found her strength. She explained how Kemi had lured her with gifts, closed the curtains, and told her to keep their meeting secret. I was scared, she said softly, but I know now it wasn't my fault. Her words struck deeply, not only in the judge's heart, but in every parent sitting in the gallery.
By the end of the session, the judge announced that a final verdict would be given in the coming week. But one thing was clear. Blessing's courage had already broken the silence. The lies and secrets that once hid in Kemi's apartment were now exposed under the bright light of justice. For the Johnsons, it was the beginning of healing, though the scars would take time to fade. A week later, the courtroom was filled once again, this time for the verdict. The air was tense, everyone waiting for the judge's decision. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and firm. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, this court finds the defendant guilty of child abuse and manipulation. She is hereby sentenced to several years in prison. Gasps echoed through the room, but for the Johnsons it was not surprise. It was relief. Justice had spoken. Kemi collapsed into her chair, covering her face as officers prepared to escort her away. The mask of the friendly neighbor was gone forever, replaced by the truth of what she had done. Neighbors who once trusted her now looked at her with anger and disappointment. Some shook their heads, whispering about how easily appearances can deceive. The lesson was loud and clear. Evil can hide behind a smile. Blessing sat quietly beside her parents, listening as the gavel struck to close the case. She felt lighter, as though a heavy stone had been lifted from her chest. Her parents wrapped their arms around her, whispering, "It is over now. You are safe." Though the scars of the past would remain, Blessing now understood that secrets meant to harm should never be kept. She had found her voice, and with it, her freedom. As they left the courthouse, the Johnsons held their daughter close, determined never to let such darkness touch her again. Neighbors greeted them with sympathy and respect, but also with a new awareness. Parents went home that day reminding their children never to hide uncomfortable truths no matter who asked. The shocking story that began with an ambulance siren ended with a powerful lesson. Silence protects no one, but truth brings light, healing, and justice.
Oh yeah, story don't finish. But wait oh, don't just waka go like that oh. If you enjoyed this gist, simply tap that red button to subscribe. Give this video a like and share it with someone that loves good stories. No pressure, but the next gist might just be sweeter than this one oh, and you won't want to miss it.